Hey there, today I want to talk about a really important dynamic in Russia's invasion of Ukraine that not enough people are thinking about. In fact, it may be the most important dynamic. The US empire, Washington, D.C., I'm not talking about the American people, but the US empire, the people in Washington, D.C. who make the decisions, absolutely love this war. And they want it to keep going as long as humanly possible. I think this violates conventional wisdom a bit. I think everybody knows that both Russia and Ukraine desperately need this war to end as soon as possible. I think we know that all of the US's allies need this war to end as soon as humanly possible. It's economically catastrophic. The world as a whole needs this war to end as soon as possible. But the United States government, the US empire, Washington, D.C., the deep state, the blob, whatever you want to call it, does not want this war to end. It is phenomenal for that institution more broadly. And I don't think people quite appreciate that. I've mentioned a couple times in the past that the greatest thing the world has going for it is US division. The fact that the United States famously has so many political problems, famously has so many people who hate each other more than they hate anybody else in the world, is a useful thing for the rest of the world, because the United States is so incredibly powerful that if we were unified or focused on anything, then the United States would have the power to make that happen out in the world. For 20 years, we haven't had that. I think for some brief moments after 9/11, there was some unity in the United States behind George W. Bush. I think we realized very quickly that he was dumb and had a lot of really bad ideas that quickly failed, as we saw certainly by the end of 2003. And there hasn't really been unity in the United States. And importantly, I don't think there's even really been unity within the military-industrial complex. I try to emphasize, folks don't seem to believe this about me, but I try to emphasize, I don't think anybody who works in the US foreign policy establishment is evil. I think these are mostly well-meaning people who want to do good things. And for the past 20 years, it has been blindingly obvious, whether consciously or subconsciously, that they have not been doing good things. I think it's possible for generals or bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. to convince themselves that they're doing worthwhile things in the broader world, but no actual soldier or humanitarian worker on the ground or spy or what have you attempting to execute U.S. policy in the Middle East could, over the past 20 years, could seriously believe that we were doing good things. No, we were just creating conflict, getting involved in things in order to keep things messed up enough to justify the budgets back home. Again, I don't believe anybody was really consciously doing this. They tell themselves, they convince themselves that what they're doing is right, but I think in their heart of hearts, they knew that the US military was not doing anything useful. That's not true right now. The US military, the US foreign policy establishment has a good thing that it is doing. It is doing something that is actively saving people rather than pointlessly murdering people for the first time in decades. That's what's happening in Ukraine right now. And I don't think people really appreciate how much this means for the people working in Washington, D.C. When we're trying to figure out how to manage which proxy is going to kill which people in Iraq and Syria, and how we can justify bombing one proxy or helping another proxy, that's not actually going to really motivate anybody in Washington, D.C. Nobody's actually going to really make sacrifices or be serious about doing this, no matter what they tell themselves to sleep at night. Saving Ukraine is a real cause. It is a very real, very good thing that the United States is doing, saving Ukraine from an outside aggressor. This works at every level of Washington, D.C., of the U.S. government. I don't think people are really appreciating the importance of the morale of the U.S. government, the U.S. foreign policy blob. we talk a ton about Russian morale and how it's affecting the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We talk a lot about how these Russian soldiers don't really want to be there. They've been misled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're poorly organized, and that's a real problem for them. I mean, what do you think the morale of the basic U.S. soldier or spy was circa 2003 to 2021? It wasn't great. It was a litany of unending failure and humiliation, and pursuit of agendas that nobody really wanted, in places where we were almost completely unwelcome. It couldn't be more different. Eastern Europe is where the U.S. military-industrial complex has wanted to be for 30 years now. They remember the good old days. All of these organizations, from intelligence community to honestly, the U.S. military as it exists right now, were all formed in the Cold War. I mean, formed to fight a titanic, colossal struggle for freedom. And the people there, I know many in my audience don't buy that, but the people who work for those institutions believe that they are fighting for freedom. So imagine how poor the morale has been over the past 20 years, where it's pretty apparent and apparent to many people, even in the United States, that they weren't actually doing anything useful. I've met many soldiers who are well aware that they weren't particularly welcomed by the people whose lands they were occupying. And that's really unpleasant. The Ukrainians love the US, would like more US involvement. It's a real switch. That's what these institutions want to do. That's what these soldiers want to do. That's what these spies want to do. That is a tremendous, tremendous shift that I think is underappreciated. There's not going to be any problem giving the defense industry more money. I'm going to continue talking about how terrible it is that we waste so much money on U.S. defense budgets, but for at least the next couple of years, that fight's over. Or more importantly, for as long as this conflict with Russia and Ukraine continues, that fight's over. I believe it is an atrocity that we spend this much money. I believe it's even more ridiculous that we spend this much money when Russia has shown itself to be so humiliatingly bad at this. But it doesn't matter really that Russia is bad at this. What matters is that they are killing people in Ukraine. What matters is that they invaded a country and they failed to such an extent that they've just managed to make everybody more worried and leave everything intact that is there to fight them. It is a colossal, colossal failure, and we are going to keep throwing money at rubbing it in their faces for years and years to come. There's this idea that, all Russia has to do is, just keep this conflict going for long enough for the U.S. public to forget about it, or for the, just for the pain to really bite in the rest of the world, the pain of what's happening here. Russia just needs to hold on, and then they'll be able to do what they want. And I think that's deeply incorrect, because that is not reckoning with how motivated the U.S. military-industrial complex now is. Just to take one example, it is fascinating just looking at news coverage in the United States. For 20 years, we had a news media that scrupulously avoided showing pictures of dead bodies. As the U.S. was obliterating children, families across the Middle East for decades, we just didn't see it. I remember Al Jazeera in the 2000s was really demonized. One of the things that we hated the most was how Al Jazeera would actually show the effects of military violence. We didn't have that in U.S. media. We just don't do that. I don't do that on my channel. I'm very serious about the Yemen conflict. There's a lot of horrific images of children who have starved to death because of the U.S.-Saudi invasion of Yemen. I don't put those forward because that's just the culture of U.S. news media. I feel like it is offensive to force those images on people. This is the way most of the U.S. news media has always acted. I think it was very controversial when the New York Times, about a year back, put up pictures of Palestinian children that had been killed. It was not, very crucially, it was not pictures of dead children, it was smiling pictures of these Palestinian children that had died. That was extraordinarily controversial, and a lot of people were very angry about that. The New York Times had done that. Since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the New York Times is just, every front page is corpses. We've got imagery of the bound corpses. I mean, it's, Russia, to be clear, Russia's doing horrible things. No question. Russia is invading a country brutally. But crucially, the US public is going to see that. We didn't see 20 years of dead people that we were killing in the Middle East. We never saw that. We actually considered, banning Al Jazeera from the United States because it occasionally showed a picture of a corpse now and again. Now all of US media is just going to be constantly pushing dead Ukrainians at us. This war is going to continue to be salient to the US public, because if the past 4 years of China public opinion polling have taught us anything, is that the US public is completely moldable in its concerns. And it was interesting just looking at the newspapers today in New York. The tabloids are back to, New York Post, Daily News are back to talking about crime. New York Times, front and center, Ukraine, and it's just going to stay there because the US journalists love this. It's really nice. I enjoy it. It's really nice to be covering something where the US is riding to the rescue. We see ourselves as riding to the rescue. We see ourselves as the cavalry. We see ourselves as the good guys. And in this instance of Russia invading Ukraine, we are the good guys. And I don't think people reckon how much pain we are willing to let the Ukrainians go through, to let the Russians go through, obviously, and to let the rest of the world go through in pursuit of our idea of being the good guys. This is finally, everything that we've done over the past 20 years was in the context of nobody really believing in what they were doing. It was in the context of it being tremendously politically contentious, our war in the Middle East. Sure, most people in Congress would try to sign off on anything that defense industry folks wanted, but they were aware that there was only so far that they could go. That's why we didn't get into Syria. People love to blame Obama for not letting us go into Syria, one of the best decisions he made in his presidency. But he also, he served it to Congress, which is very, very, he said, okay, well, if Congress wants us to get into Syria, they can put us into Syria. And the Congress, super defense industry interest owned Congress, knew they couldn't do that because of the US public, because the US public wasn't interested. And it's another aspect of this war, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that it's worked out perfectly from the context of the concerns of a US congressperson. They can sound tough. They can propose nonsense that they know the executive will never do in terms of direct US involvement. They can just get up there and talk about these horrors, the horrors of war that the US public is being shown for the first time in 50 years. Talk about the horrors of war that are being shown and fight against it and make tons of money fighting against it, make tons of money for their military-industrial complex masters without putting a single US soldier in jeopardy. The Russia-Ukraine war is the perfect conflict for Washington, D.C. We get to be good guys, we get to sell tons of weapons, and we never, ever have to see a single dead US soldier. This is an ideal conflict, and the stress that it puts the rest of the world through is entirely secondary to the United States. If the world faces a unified United States, which I think is what we have from the policy perspective, even I, a critic of the US military-industrial complex who still thinks we should cut the defense budget in half, I support arming Ukraine heavily. I'm a huge dissenter, and I'm all for it. And if the world faces a unified United States on something, there really isn't much that that the rest of the world can do. And I think that that's something that folks should keep in mind. It is in the interest of Russia. It is in the interest of China. It is in the interest of any anti-U.S. imperial, anti-U.S. empire person in the entire world that this war end as quickly as possible. Because every hour, day, month, and year, I think year is a real possibility, that it goes forward is just candy for the United States. It's what we want. We're already seeing extraordinary fallout in the world from just a couple months of war. Sri Lanka, Tunisia, countries that were already going through crises seem to be falling further into them. An extraordinary thing we've witnessed over the past couple weeks is the depreciation of the Japanese yen. A country that was a few decades ago put about as a real challenge to the United States, well, now we're watching its currency depreciate as it backs our play to a greater extent than any other non-European country. As the world falls apart under the pressure of Russia-Ukraine war, higher oil and gas prices, higher food prices, it really only works in the US's favor. We do have resources that other folks don't. We do have factors of independence that other folks don't. I really do think that this is a war that we're going to have to deal with for quite some time unless Russia wises up and just gives up, because it's not something that Putin's regime is going to benefit from. This war continuing only makes the United States more powerful. Only creates situations in which the United States can act the way it's been acting for the past 20 years and consider itself to be heroic in doing so. That we faced a ton of pushback from our sanctions policy against Iran, because I think most people recognize outside of the United States that Iran is almost exclusively defending itself from the United States and its proxies. But Russia's an aggressor. I think it would be incredibly insane, short-sighted, and stupid fight for the United States to pick over India purchasing Russian oil. But the United States has always done, or at least since the Cold War, has done a lot of incredibly short-sighted, stupid, long-run, idiotic things. I think we're getting to a point now where Europe is talking more seriously about boycotting Russian oil. And the thing that they will do, literally the day after Europe boycotts Russian oil, is they will start insisting that nobody else buys Russian oil. And of course, that will implicate India. That will implicate countries all over the world that are already suffering economic crises. And I don't think that will slow the United States one iota, or Europe. Europe believes itself to be in danger, though I think Russian military performance indicates that they are not. And the United States believes that we're the good guys. So the longer this conflict, this Russian attempt to rebuild its old empire, the longer that continues, the more powerful the United States gets. And the less free a world I think we get more broadly. Anyway, that is an unproduced video. I am currently doing a very deep dive on Yemen, and I hope to have a produced video on that for you next week. We shall see. Regardless, thanks for being here. Please do like, subscribe, let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks so much.